Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Joanne Conklin. I'm the director of the David Winton Bell Gallery, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our talk this evening by acclaimed photographer and Brown alumnus, Bill Jacobson. Bill was first recognized for several series of out-of-focus images of people and landscapes, and particularly for his images called Interim Portraits. These ghostly photographs were printed in a very high tonal range and were defocused or thrown slightly out of focus. Begun during the height of the AIDS epidemic, Interim Portraits are said to evoke both that loss, excuse me, and the inability of capturing a true likeness of a human in portraiture or memory. Bill's presentation today is held in conjunction with our current exhibition in the lobby titled Recent Acquisitions, Photography and Abstraction. And I'd like to just do a little call out to Allison Pappas, graduate student in art history who helped on that show and wrote the label copy. And if anyone doesn't know, who also curated the Danny Lyons exhibition. So one of our talented students, thank you. So many of Bill's works could have been included in an exhibition that worked on exploring the search for abstraction in photography. The work that is included is called Place Series number 512, and it's from 2011. And it seems quite different from the image that's on the screen at the moment, and from some of his earlier works. I mean, clearly it's the piece that's in the show that you will see later is sharply focused. It references the built environment rather than human emotions, which were more of what was going on in the interim portraits. And it has drawn associations with modernist works such as Albers and Mondrian. At first glance, the photograph looks mostly like a minimalist painting. It's a red rectangle on a white background. And it's only a small hint of a shadow along the rectangle's right side that breaks the illusion of it being a painting and identifies the photographic subject for what it is, which is simply a card propped against a white wall. At lunch today, I asked Bill about the underlying thread that connects his altered images, which he continued through 2003 and is maybe returning to. He'll show us later. And the works he's been doing for the last 10 years. And he obligingly offered an interpretation from a critic friend who pointed to the fact that they all address perception in some manner, whether that's how humans see or how cameras see. And as I thought about this, I realized that for me, there's another quality. There's a lyricism in all of the works that I think sort of ties them together, and he will talk to us more about that. Bill graduated from Brown in 1977. He received an MFA from the San Francisco Art Institute in '81. He worked for several years as a commercial photographer, and he had his first exhibition in 1993 at the Gray Art Gallery. Since then, he has exhibited widely throughout the US and Europe. His work is held in most major photography collections and others. It's a long list. I'm going to mention a few: the George Eastman House, International Center for Photography, the Metropolitan, the Guggenheim, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the Hammer in LA, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, among others. He also has 7 monographs of his work that have been published, and the most recent were released in 2017, the first simply called 945 Madison Avenue, and taking its subject as the former Whitney Museum building, designed by Marshall Brewer, and a second book called Figureground, which are portraits of people who have turned away from the camera slightly and are staring out into a landscape, and they're incredibly evocative, and I want to ask him a question about that later. Bill is the recipient of numerous awards and residencies. He received a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2012 and a Pollock-Krasner Grant in 2017. He currently teaches at the International Center of Photography BARD program. And I'd like to thank Jacques Caleb from the Brown's English department for several years ago suggesting that we bring Bill up for a lecture. It's taken far too long to pull this together, but I am truly delighted that he is joining us tonight to share his work. Please join me in welcoming Bill Jacobson.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Joanne, for the invitation to come back to Brown and for the very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be back in List Auditorium, where, as a freshman at Brown in 1973, I took my first ever art history class. And while I had started taking photographs in high school, I credit this extraordinary class with making me decide to be an artist. Co-taught by an art historian, a sculptor, and an architectural historian, this class taught me what it means to understand and construct space in a work of art. We'll go to the first slide. After completing an independent major at Brown in 1977, I wanted to immerse myself in an art school environment and also live on the West Coast. And I ended up getting an MFA from the San Francisco Art Institute. They were very challenging and extraordinary years to be out there. And by extraordinary, I mean both good and bad. It was the height of gay liberation, and as I was just coming out at that time, it was the perfect place to be. On the flip side, the gay city council member Harvey Milk and Mayor George Moscone were murdered by an ex-cop in City Hall within weeks of my arrival, which also coincided with the very horrible Jonestown massacre. And then, slowly and horribly, the AIDS crisis began to appear and take its Holocaust-like toll. Then in 1982, I moved to New York, and for the next 7 years, I quit making art. Being in the center of the AIDS epidemic left many of us paralyzed creatively. Mostly, I did commercial photography for galleries and museums to make a living, and I would spend weekends at the flea markets, combing through boxes of tintypes, daguerreotypes, old silver prints, Polaroids, and color snapshots. Of the thousands that I collected, I was most drawn to those that were distressed, faded, or otherwise altered through neglect, time, or some odd chemical reaction. Looking at these images, I kept coming back to Roland Barthes' quote in Camera Lucida that every photograph is essentially of a dead moment. And this intricate relationship between time and photography has stayed with me all these years. As the subjects in these images stare out at us, I'm brought deeply into what I imagine their lives might be like, as well as into the beauty of the silvery tones, the light that reveals the folds in the clothing, and the information that lurks in the backgrounds, and the quiet, still expressions on the people's faces. A photograph can tell us many truths, but they're also vastly withholding. While we stare into their eyes, what do they really tell us? Did these people die young or live to be old? Were they filled with sorrow or with great joy? And while photography only gives us brief glimpses into their lives, they could also give me hours of wonder. It was truly the not knowing that intrigued me, and it was these contradictions between absence and presence, between how the mind remembers and how the camera sees, that have been the basis for my work for the last 30 years. So now we'll begin looking at the pictures that I've taken for myself. And in 1989, I sort of broke my 7-year dry spell, and I started taking pictures that were really influenced by the snapshots that I had been collecting all those years. A friend gave me an old Rolleiflex 2¼ camera, and it seemed like the perfect tool for me to start taking photographs again. The ground glass was kind of foggy because the camera was about 40 or 50 years old, and just looking through it, and by putting it slightly out of focus, it started to feel a lot like the snapshots that I had been collecting. It was a time to really start traveling and getting out of New York. After 7 years there, I was feeling claustrophobic, and I just needed some time and space away. So I bought a car and started doing weekend trips out of the city, either out to the Hamptons to be by the beach or out to Pennsylvania, really anywhere where there was open space and horizon line. The time in New York really felt like there was just a series of brick walls that I'd been looking at, and I just needed space. And so these pictures both talk about travel, they talk about the old snapshots, they talk about, just fantasies and remembrances of when I was a kid. Some people thought I was actually taking old snapshots and blowing them up, but in reality I was doing it to kind of not mimic, but sort of refer and reflect and suggest the pictures that had come from the 7-year collection. So I think everybody, if they look through family albums, has beach pictures. And so these are a bit of a tribute to that. As I said before, it was also really the very bleak, dark years of the AIDS crisis. And so much of these old pictures had to do with memory, had to do with people being on the planet for a brief time. You never really knew if people in these pictures, had lived long lives or short lives. And basically all the people in the pictures I had collected were deceased, one could assume. And the way a picture would sort of talk and suggest brief lives on this planet really came into the next body of work that I produced. These, as I mentioned, were called the interim landscapes. And that word interim was very evocative for me in those years because somebody who's an interim office holder is really somebody who's in office for a brief period of time. And it's really that relationship to time and that word interim that figured into the interim landscapes and also into the next body of work, which I called the Interim Portraits. And these, as Joanne suggested, were really about not a document of the AIDS crisis, and it's really important to make that differentiation. They were often written about at that time, that I was doing pictures of people with AIDS, but that's really not true. The work was really about an emotional kind of reaction, really about what memory does and how we have relationships with people throughout all our life, whether it's lovers, friends, relatives, and what it means to lose somebody, and then over time, in our minds, sort of play with how we remember, and how the memory works and how it doesn't work, and how we lose bits of information, or we make up bits of information over time. So these are all from the Interim Portraits, circa 1992-93. I'm going to show a number of vertical pictures today that are 2 at a time. And it's partly because I always think about pictures in relationship to others, partly in the books that I've done and partly for exhibition. But none of them are diptychs, even though they're kind of displayed in a diptych manner here. Usually what I do for most bodies of work is title the series, but I never give individual titles to any of the pictures aside from my negative number. So the one on the left is, I think, Interim Portrait number 531. The one on the right is Interim Portrait number 572. So it's really just a numbering system because I didn't want to bring the people's names. I didn't want to sentimentalize these people or the photographs for that matter. So really it's a kind of deliberate numbering system to keep it a little bit obscure and to be suggestive. It also obliquely refers to the way in the Holocaust people had numbers put on their arms. And this was a bit of a Holocaust in some ways at this time. So from the Interim Portraits, I did a number of lying down figures called the Interim Figures. Then in '94 came a parallel group called the Interim Couples. This is the only one from that. This is also one of the interim figures. But you'll see what happens as the work goes on. There's a kind of grayscale that happens. It wasn't intentional. It just seemed in a very intuitive way how the work happened. But I went from the very light ones to a kind of gray one, a number of gray pictures. And then over time they get darker to where the end ones in these, the various series are very, very dark and black. And the time frame for this work, the figurative work, is really 92 when the interim portrait started through 97, 98, and 99. So this was a companion series called Songs of Sentient Beings. And the word sentient beings, or the expression, came from something I learned going to lectures at the Zen Center in San Francisco back in the 70s. And you would hear the Zen priests talk about it, and I looked it up, and basically sentient beings is an acknowledgement of beings who are filled with great knowledge or feeling. And there was a very poetic stance to that, which I liked. So I brought that in to be the title of the series. The prints, of course, look quite large here. In reality, I editioned them at two sizes, 20 by 24 and 30 by 40. So these are also from the song series. It was interesting. People asked me, how did I find these models? And they came in odd ways and curious ways. If I photographed somebody who was very good looking, for example, often they would be a little bit full of themselves, and it became a kind of ego thing. Generally, I'd meet somebody at a party or sometimes on the street, sometimes at a cafe. It really varied. And I would tell them about the project, and they just felt like the right person to bring to it. And it just happened in a very organic way, which pleased me. I couldn't photograph people I was very close to. I found I had too many preconceptions. The other thing I'll say about this work, it was all done with a 4x5 view camera. And there's something very special about that tool. You have to get very still, very quiet with it. You're looking through a ground glass. You're having the hood up over your head. Every sheet of film is done individually. So you actually have to set up the shot, then tell the model to really hold the picture, to be as still as they can, because then you have to put in the film plate, you pull out the dark slide, and you make an exposure of about a second or two, sometimes longer. And so there's a lot of dialogue that happens with the model. Also, when you're looking through the ground glass, you're really seeing what's in front of you. And I say partly to students when I teach, and also just something I remind myself, that any gesture with a 4x5, because it's very specific, it's very accurate, but this looks different than that, looks different than that. The body, if it's turned this way versus this way, it can be a very slight turn, but it's going to be a very, very different effect emotionally and visually in a photograph. So it's a lot of setting up these pictures is partly the lighting, it's partly the really working with the model to get the right gesture and the right feel. And then, of course, there's a big editing process that happens after I get back, develop film, to really pick the 1 or 2 pictures out of 20 or 30 from each shoot that feel right, and then we go into the printing process, which is something that if they get very large, I send out, but generally I prefer to do myself. And all of this work we've seen so far are analog silver gelatin photographs. Coming up is an exhibition that I had in the University of Michigan around '99, which was a survey of all the Outoffocus work that we've seen to date. But this shows how they look installed and framed in a big room. So around the time the show happened, I took an extended trip to India. I'd always wanted to go, and I had some friends who wanted to do the trip. And now these pictures, I'm going to show you nothing from India tonight, but basically the time there, the 6 weeks there, it made me think about color in a way that I never had before. For those who have been or those who haven't, the colors in India are very intense, very vibrant. And at the same time, the street scenes there are extraordinary. You're on the street and it's some level like being on Mars. It feels slightly familiar, but basically totally unfamiliar. And you'd go back at night and I would just have dreams of people walking through these villages and through the cities. And I came back after the 6-week trip, and my time in New York and walking the streets of New York looked different to me and came more alive in a way after having the experience of this India trip. And all the portraiture work I had done to date had a lot to do with memory, with loss, this idea of people coming and going in our lives. And so coming back to New York and walking the streets, I realized in some ways it's similar in that we're always experiencing human activity, people coming, walking by us. The streets in New York are very intense. And then generally we go home at night and we forget about it, or it maybe appears in dreams there. But generally it's so distinct on the street for a fraction of a second, then that second never exists anymore. So I wanted to bring the 4x5 view camera out onto the streets of New York and in some ways talk about that transition, about that idea of things coming and going, about the fact, a bit like water, about things always changing, always being in flux. And so basically I couldn't control these people in any way. When I worked with models, we could pose, we could do things. But essentially this work, which remained untitled, I put a number to each of these pictures, but there was no title for a number of reasons. But anyways, I wanted to leave it vague and open, but I would go out onto the streets with a 4x5, and I could essentially only set up based on the architecture. You know, I would spend, a lot of them were done in the summer when the light was bright, and I would basically walk around for an hour, find a good location, and then just stay there for about another hour to 2 hours, watching the people move through the city and really thinking about just how beautiful city life is and how much photographers, you know, there's a whole series by many people of street photography. So this is a kind of tribute to that, but it also, I think, continues the work I had done earlier, where I'm talking about really change and how things never stay the same, and also how beautiful human activity is. So mostly they were done on Upper Fifth Avenue because I like the simplicity of the facades there and the density of people moving through the city streets. And it's really just an act of looking. So much of photography is about observation. And so, you know, to set up a picture like this one, all I could really do was, you know, like I said, base it on the architecture. And then just sit there. It's a bit like watching a parade. And you're always sort of mesmerized and fascinated by what comes by. And you never know what's going to come down the pike next. You know, I'd have the film plate inserted in the camera. And then you're a bit also like a hunter, just kind of waiting for that right moment. Or as Cartier-Bresson would say, that decisive moment. And until you get the film back, you never quite know if you caught it or not. This picture was taken in the afternoon of 9/11 in New York. I had been home that morning and, you know, heard about everything that was happening, turned on the TV. And then by noon or so, the trade towers had come down and everybody was terrified. You didn't know if there was going to be an atomic bomb or what was going to happen next. And a friend called me on the phone and we chatted, and I remember him yelling at me, "Get out there and take pictures." And I didn't know what else to do, so I grabbed the 4x5. And I was living in lower Manhattan in the East Village, and I walked over to around Broadway and 4th Street, and there were no cars because, you know, the cops had closed all the traffic down, and you just had people who were out walking, and that's the cloud of smoke from the Trade Center collapse that was just wafting over towards Brooklyn and kind of continued for a day or two. I can tell you it was a horrible time to be in New York, and yeah, and this picture is a kind of constant reminder of it for me. So, every body of work that I've shown you is usually a several-year kind of project. So I did the Outoffocus color in the horizontal format for about 2 to 3 years, and then spent 2 years doing vertical ones. And there was a shift in the vertical ones. Partly they started to emphasize the architecture a bit more. And often there was this kind of yawning gap between buildings, and a kind of symmetry to the pictures that happened towards the end. It wasn't anything that I was doing consciously, but when I look back, I could see this kind of, you know, not a grid, but a kind of, you know, the space between, and the architecture, of course, becoming more kind of paramount in the images. And every body of work for me is a kind of learning curve. I go into it with a preconceived idea, and I make work based on that idea, but over time it changes, sometimes within my control, sometimes completely out. And then it's usually the last few pictures of a series as I'm kind of winding down and I'm looking from them. And that's where the learning goes on. That's where I really find the clues that are going to feed the next body of work that comes subsequent. So this picture was 2002, 2003. And then a year later, I had something fairly cathartic happen where I'd been in a loft in the East Village for 20 years. My landlord said I had to move. He wanted to sell the building. I could no longer stay. And so after 20 years of kind of being a bit of a pack rat, I needed to basically pack up everything that I owned. And more than packing, it was really a time of consideration. I had to handle, touch, think about, consider everything in this big loft. And it took me literally 3 months to do it, to go through not only the packing, but to decide what to throw out, what I wanted to bring, kind of how to reinvent my life. And so it started me thinking also about changing the work in a major way. And after 15 years of making the Outoffocus work that I've been showing you, I decided to really think about the physical world, the constructed space. So much of what I packed and thought about and collected, I realized was rectangular in nature. It was an odd thing, but pretty much every photograph I had, or my whole collection of snapshots, most of the furniture, I ended up after the 3 months of packing with this massive pile of rectangular boxes. The room that was then empty was rectangular. And it just started me thinking that it's a real primal aspect of the physical world that we live in. Oddly, none of the out-of-focus pictures, because of the diffusion, there were no right angles in any of that picture except for the very edges. And even some, like in the songs pictures I showed you, I had diffused those edges to the extent that they, in themselves, had become kind of curved and followed the lines of the body. So really, after making non-rectangular pictures for 15 years, and the body itself is very non-rectangular, I started thinking about the rectangle as a basis. And I spent 5 years where I was traveling a lot. I lived in Berlin for a period. I spent time in the UK. And the title of this work is very different than the previous titles. I call this work A Series of Human Decisions. And I wanted to really acknowledge the rectangle as something that you rarely find in nature. I mean, perhaps never. And that it's really a man-made concept. And so there's a real shift in the work. At the same time, there's something very implicitly human in a man-made creation. All those years I spent going to flea markets, I would look around and it was kind of a museum at a flea market. There's something you'd see thousands of objects in a day, high art, low art, you'd see crap, you'd see wonderful things, beautiful things, but all of it was made by somebody. And there's something very specific, very human, and very intense in that kind of acknowledgement. So part of this work, I think, is not that different. If I was acknowledging sort of lives coming and going and all the out-of-focus portraiture work, I think the subtext for this work is a kind of similar conceit, where everything that's made here was made by somebody for a purpose, with a passion, and then there's a kind of layering that happens where somebody made that desk, somebody made the lamp, somebody made that room. This is actually a room in a very important Art Deco house that a collector of mine bought, and I went up and photographed it the day he bought it, so this is all the original furniture in it. I photographed in artist studios in the UK, both at the Royal College and the Royal Academy. This was from Berlin, just walking the streets, and it's a kind of funny sort of small carnival thing that was opening, on a street corner for a week. And then I went up to New Haven, and I photographed in the very important Paul Rudolph School of Art and Architecture. And then one other aspect of it was photographing psychiatrists' couches, which I did in New York, partly because that's a place where decisions are made as well. And I was interested, in the spaces which are designed often just by the shrinks, seldom by an architect, and what the couch is and how varied these couches were. So this is actually the cover of the book. This picture. And partly, that linear aspect of the couch and of that pillow I was drawn to. But I also was drawn to the fact that you could see the imprint of the many humans who would, lie down on that couch to talk about their issues and their problems with this particular shrink. And again, the title, A Series of Human Decisions, because that's really what the built world is. And then there's one more layer, which is, of course, my decision to take a photograph of what somebody else has created and then to present the print in a certain size, in a certain context. So that's one more kind of layer that gets added to the whole puzzle. This is this famous house in Holland where I had received an artist residency to go and stay for a week. And I photographed partly the house, but also the neighborhood as part of this Human Decisions project. It's by a famous architect named John Haydick that some of you may know, and it's called the Wall House. So you see the kind of linear aspect of this building. And then in the middle of this project, it was actually right around the halfway point, I needed a break from the built world and from the physical world, but I wanted to continue that kind of linear, rectangular-based kind of way of looking at the world. So in 2007, 2008, I ended up taking 3 trips out to various desert locations, spending about a week, first at the Painted Desert in Arizona, which is here, and then I went to the Great Salt Lake, which is on the left-hand side, and the White Sands in New Mexico, which is on the right. and I did a series called Some Plains. And for me, this work, it's not about the desert, it's not about the landscape, really. It's about that extraordinary light, and I think the bleached lightness in these, goes back to the Interim Portraits. But I also wanted to do a series that was about two equal but separate shapes, kind of playing off all the architecture that I have been looking at. And it's very hard to find that thing in nature, that quality of that straight line. I did a lot of research online, and a lot of desert locations in the US that I thought about, had mountains, had cactus, none of which I wanted. And so it was really a matter of finding the right places and then doing these 3-week trips, these 3 one-week trips out to find these places where I could create these two kind of stacked shapes, one on top of another. So, and these were from white sands, but it's at the very end of the day when the white hillsides were in kind of deep, dark shadow. And this shows you an installation view of the work at Julie Saul Gallery in New York. So as you can see, I was kind of obsessed with the notion of the rectangle at this point. And, as I told Joanne over lunch today, every body of work is a kind of synthesis of the body of work that preceded it. So I want to take that idea of the rectangle, which is really a photograph often, and I started basically wanting to create an equation between a photograph that I took, in this case just of this fence, and then it's a rephotograph. And then this is just, as Joanne said, this is the picture that's out there. It's just a red board. But you can see it's a picture of a red board. And I wanted to kind of, again, create that kind of equivalence between a picture and a blank space. And then sometimes there'd be a kind of multiplication. And, I love walking by construction sites or seeing the detritus that's outside of a construction site. Because often you see sort of boards that are layered and boards that are kind of stacked up. And you realize that it's like I discovered when I moved from my loft, whether it's a sheet of paper like this or whether it's a room, these walls aren't really rectangular, but so many are, the windows we look out of. It's such a constant. And as Joanne said, so much of my work is about perception. And if the first 15 years we're talking about people coming and going through our lives, the last 15 years has really been an acknowledgement of the kind of physical spaces that we live in. I'm not trying to survey all of them by any means, but it's a kind of suggestion that we live in this world that's created by rectangles, so much of the built and physical world. So, as Joanne mentioned, the title for this work is called Place Series, and the word series is in parentheses. We're always creating a sense of place, through building, through construction. Often architecture starts with the natural environment and a foundation goes in, then a wall goes up, then another wall goes up. These are a bit of a tribute to that. The other thing I love is, say, going by a bulletin board where you see a lot of people just tacked up a variety of notices about things, which it's its own kind of odd series of rectangles. So I made this in a studio at one point. And it's a bit, of a recognition of the beauty of the kind of multiplicity of rectangles that people often create. This people refer to as a kind of Mondrian, and it suggests it. What it actually is, and nobody's going to get it from the picture, but it's a bit of the backstory. I was driving around Culver City in Los Angeles about 10 years ago, and it was a 100-foot high mural on the side of a big industrial building. And I found a lot of humor in it, and I photographed it, and then, rephotographed it in the studio. So it's a kind of equation of high art, low art, no art. It's just a box. This is actually one of the boxes I used when I moved from the old loft to the new place. This I did I've been to McDowell Colony 7 times, all of which have been really important to my development and really good times to think. There's a darkroom there where I've made a lot of work. And so this is on the grounds at McDowell Colony. It's simple. It's a whiteboard in a landscape. But again, often I think a lot of architecture is a kind of series of whiteboards in a landscape. This is a detail of a bit of architecture in Chelsea. And I actually took the picture. It's a friend who owns the gallery. And then I actually turned it upside down and then rephotographed it in the studio. And then, again, right at the end of the project, I started thinking about the body again. I had a long hiatus away, and I started thinking actually about the differences and the similarities between that beautiful line of the body and the rectangle. And I did a number of pictures. This is the only one that I liked, but I ended up doing a number of pictures right at the end of the play series of nudes kind of in front of a series of rectangles. And again, it's that sort of funny play between the body line and the rectangle line. And then it was time to change the work again. I wanted to get back into nature. I luckily had another residency up in McDowell, and so I ended up doing this new body of work called Figureground. These are more recent, 2016 and 17. A number of the people there are either residents of, colonists who were there with me. Some are, people who worked around there, and others were friends who I shot in upstate New York. So it's very simple. It's just people turned away from the camera towards the landscape. And I think for me it was a way of my re-engaging with the landscape, kind of continuing the previous ideas of bodies, of figures. But in some ways the work, I won't say it failed, but it didn't accomplish for the viewer what I wanted it to accomplish, which was really about that beautiful line of the edge of the body. It was one of the reasons I made the choice, A, to use the 8x10 view camera for these instead of the 4x5, because you can get much more depth of field. And when you see, you kind of see it here actually. It's funny, I don't on the screen, but when you see it at the scale, you realize that the figure is very, very sharp, and the landscape totally recedes. It's a little sharper towards the figure and proceeds, as it goes away. And actually, I love seeing them at the scale. It's bigger than I ever printed them. But the prints were quite large. But I think it's coming back. Maybe it's the Trump years we live in, the craziness of these times. But I think this body of work for me was suggesting the kind of not knowing. I think all the in-focus work was a kind of acknowledgement of something real, something tangible. And when I came back to this work a couple years ago, I think it was just an internal kind of realization of not knowing again. And I wanted to play with that. So I think these figures are gazing towards something that they're aware of, but who really knows what lies out there, what lies ahead? And so, I spent about a year and a half photographing in different places. Makes me want to make prints this size. So the ones exhibited were quite large. They were about 40 by 50, so but not nearly this big. And then, like I said, basically every picture towards the end starts to have clues towards where the next one's going to go. So this is the show I did, actually, of the work, or one of the two shows at Julie Saul in New York. So you can see, the prints were quite large. But what I got from this body of work, actually, as much as I love the figure and the line of the figure that I talked about, the thing that really got me were the out-of-focus backgrounds. And as much as I had photographed figures out of focus and urban landscapes out of focus, I had never really taken the camera, out to nature. And I had a residency last summer in Virginia, really up in the mountains, and it was a very beautiful pastoral place. I'd never spent much time in the South before, and so I ended up doing this new body of work. And these prints right now exist only very small, but I was telling Joanne I'm going to start with a very big darkroom, and I want to start blowing these up to 30 by 40 or 40 by 50 inches. One of the reasons, too, I came back to this work was all the in-focus work had been done as inkjet prints. And I love them. I can make a more beautiful print on a matte paper in color as an inkjet print that I could ever do before. But I wanted something handmade again. And so the out-of-focus work can never really be well reproduced as a digital print. You get banding, you never get the smooth transitions. And even seeing it here, digitally projected, you really lose something of how beautiful a silver gelatin print can be of it. So I basically gave myself a task that would force me back into the darkroom again. And so that was, I was partly intrigued by the autofocus, and I said, if I do autofocus, I've got to go back in the darkroom. So it all came together to kind of set me off on this new path. Kind of an old path, but a kind of reinvention of it. So, and I think sometimes I borrow titles again, and I think this work won't be, I'm going to just call it interim. Not portraits, not landscape, it'll just be interim. At least that's my working title for this moment. So it's a mix of people in the landscape and just landscape without figure. And I kind of like having that back and forth between the two at the moment. It's also a trip seeing these this size too. It kind of gives me ideas. They were fun to do. These were other people who were writers and poets and composers who were at the residency in Virginia with me, and often after dinner, when the light was very, going down and it was dusk, we would go out into the fields in the area, sometimes in the car, sometimes just walking, and spend an hour, posing, looking, and doing the pictures that you see here. And then other days I would just go up by myself with a camera. So this is the last picture, and all I can really say is that 43 years later, I'm still looking, I'm still making pictures, and I'm excited by what I see, and the adventure goes on. So thank you very much. Thank you. If anybody has questions, I'm happy to. Yeah, please.
Thank you for returning to Brown, and thanks also for spending time looking at our students' work this afternoon. I know they appreciated that. Can you talk, I'm a painter, so I'm looking at these photographs as though they were paintings, and I really get the strong sense that obviously you've looked at a lot of work. Can you just talk a little bit about some of the influences, other than the obvious influences that you've already mentioned about life experiences, but or historical references or other contemporary artists whose work you're drawn to?
It's interesting. I don't often talk about it when I talk about the work, but the thing I've done in part to make a living since I moved to New York was to photograph for other artists. And I've had 3 very good clients since around 1990, so I think that's going on almost as long as the work, almost 30 years, which is the time we cover here. And so I've worked pretty consistently for Bryce Marden, for Robert Ryman, and also for the Dia Art Foundation, both in the city at their branches and also up in Beacon. And if I had to pick, I also worked for Marion Goodman for 5 years in the 80s, and I photographed all the Gerhard Richter work that she was showing then and the Kiefer work that she was showing. But probably the Richter work, his play between autofocus and abstract and photography and painting was a very strong influence. I also worked for Pace Gallery for 5 years in the 80s where I was shooting all the Agnes Martin paintings. And so I think, between especially the Dia work, in their program with Donald Judd, and a lot of the minimalist work that they've shown over the years. And Robert Ryman is probably the one painter who I've been closest to, who, as most people know, made a kind of career out of, people simply call it painting white rectangles. I think what he did was far more complex, and the rigor and the complexity of his work was probably a real primary influence on me. So, but a lot of the history of minimalist painting and sculpture probably is the thing I've looked at the most and thought about the most. So, but some artists I think hole up in a studio and don't look, but I think for me New York's been such a kind of extraordinary treasure trove of work, and I try to get out and look at a lot of it. What I regret not doing in some ways is collecting over the years. But I also, I've thought about it a lot. It would have been wonderful to own some of this work that I've seen, and it was inexpensive years ago, but I feel like I've collected with my eyes, if not with my wallet. And I think that collecting of information, a lot of the students that I teach, I'm kind of amazed that they come into a graduate program, having so little kind of awareness of contemporary art history. And so, I just think getting out and looking and seeing what's there to know what's come before has always been really important to me. So, anybody else?
Thank you so much for your talk. With any of the blur work, you hit a very fine kind of mark in terms of how much you're showing us and how much you're not showing us in terms of the blur. I'm curious, when you move closer to either of these poles of figurative or non-figurative, or recognizable or non-recognizable, what you think the significance is when you move towards one of those poles, and what...
You mean by the poles in focus versus out of focus?
Sure, or recognizable and not recognizable.
Right.
Some of them are more or less, and I'm curious. You're clearly very aware of it.
You mean within the in focus works? Within the out of focus work, there's variety?
Correct. Yes.
Got it. It's a good point. I mean, honestly, in this last body of work, I haven't resolved the focus issues, because partly, because they're done in a larger, they're done partly in the camera and also in the enlarger. And so in this new work, it's not fully resolved, and I still have more work to do on it. In the other bodies of work, usually within each group, they're fairly consistent. I do say one thing, though. It's not a big deal, but I kind of avoid the word blur, only for a technical reason. Blur actually refers technically to motion or movement, and none of them are done that way. The technical word that a writer taught me years ago is defocused, which I think is probably more accurate. And defocusing can happen a lot of different ways. So I think within each body of work has its own kind of technical things. I showed the white ones, the gray ones, and then the very dark ones, the songs of sentient beings. Each one was very specific and intrinsic to that body of work. The songs ones actually made with a homemade lens on the enlarger to diffuse it even more. So I think, yeah, what you say is actually accurate. Each one has its own degree of diffusion, which I think for me felt appropriate to that time and that moment. But within each group, it should be fairly constant.
Thank you.
Sure.
Whoa. Hey, Bill, thank you. You said early on with the song series, just very quickly, that it was easier for you to photograph strangers as opposed to people that you had some kind of like personal relationship, which is very interesting. I suppose as a kind of sustained impersonality, and sort of like in the work that you've shown today. Could you just talk a little bit more about that? What's sort of important for you about that kind of almost anonymity with a figure?
I think it's almost the opposite. It's if I know somebody well, I have too many preconceived ideas about what they look like. Or I was used to certain gestures, or was used to a certain kind of emotional presence. Whereas if I didn't know the person, I could actually step back and see them more like seeing a statue, where there's not a kind of, I just want to see the physicality and to see what I could do with them in the studio, in the course of the hour or 2 hours that the pictures took. So I just think if it was somebody who I knew well or somebody who I was intimate with, it just became too loaded. It became I had too many preconceived ideas, and I wanted to come into each of these, sessions kind of fresh and sort of distanced a little bit. So I felt I could actually get something that was more emotional by not having preconceived ideas about what they should look like. And also I think I felt less responsibility. When you do pictures of somebody, either as a commission or somebody who you have a relationship with, then there's a lot of expectations on their part about how they're going to look. I think I felt more responsibility to them if it was somebody I was close to, that they look good or not good, or if they were disappointed or not disappointed. And, you know, it was a little, I shouldn't have done it, but one time I went to get in good with this art dealer in New York. And so I invited him over to shoot pictures. And I remember him going, oh, I look like a truck driver. I don't know, he just didn't like the way he looked in the pictures. And I shouldn't have offered it in the first place. And it kind of reinforced the fact that it's better to keep some distance. So. Anybody else?
Well, thank you very much, Bill.
My pleasure. Thanks for coming, everybody. Thank you so much.